Waitress gave her last $20 to crying child at bus stop. His father, the vampire king, saw everything. Hello, everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The night air was cold enough to sting the skin, the kind of late autumn chill that crept through thin clothing and settled deep in the bones. Streetlights cast pale yellow circles across the quiet bus stop on the corner of Maple Street and 7th Avenue, where the last bus of the night would not arrive for another 15 minutes. Emily Carter stepped out of the small diner across the street, her shoulders heavy with exhaustion after a long shift that seemed to stretch forever. She was 24 years old, a waitress who worked double shifts most days just to keep up with rent in a city that never seemed to stop demanding more. Her sneakers were worn thin, her jacket a size too large from a thrift store, and inside her purse was the last $20 she had until her next paycheck 3 days away. She had already counted that money 5 times tonight, quietly planning how to stretch it into groceries and bus fare. As she walked toward the bus stop, the wind carried a sound that made her slow down. It was a small sound at first, almost lost beneath the passing cars and distant sirens. A child crying. Emily turned her head and saw him sitting alone on the metal bench beneath the flickering streetlight. The boy looked no older than 8 years old. His dark hair fell messily across his forehead, and his small hands were clenched in the sleeves of a coat that clearly did not belong to a child his size. His shoulders trembled as he tried to wipe tears from his cheeks. No adult stood nearby. No parents searched the street. Just a lonely child crying quietly into the cold night. Emily hesitated for only a moment before walking over. "Hey there," she said gently, kneeling slightly so. Her voice would not sound scary. "Are you okay?" The boy looked up slowly, his eyes bright with tears that reflected the streetlight like tiny pieces of gold. "I'm lost," he whispered. Emily felt something tighten painfully in her chest. She had seen many difficult things in this city. People in trouble. People ignored by everyone rushing past them. But seeing a child alone like this felt different. "Where are your parents, sweetie?" she asked softly. The boy shook his head and sniffed. "I do not know." Emily glanced up and down the street again. Still no one searching. No worried voice calling for a missing child. Just the quiet city night and the soft sound of the wind. Her stomach twisted with worry when the boy whispered another sentence that nearly broke her heart. "I'm hungry." Emily slowly opened her purse. Inside was a folded $20 bill. The last money she had in the world until Friday. If she gave it away, tomorrow would be difficult. Maybe impossible. She could already imagine skipping meals just to make it through the week. But when she looked back at the boy sitting alone under the cold streetlight, shivering and trying not to cry, the decision came faster than she expected. She placed the $20 gently into his small hand. "Go inside the store across the street and buy us something warm to eat," she said with a soft smile. "It is going to be okay." The boy stared at the money as if he could not believe what he was holding. But Emily did not notice something important happening at that exact moment. Across the street, parked quietly along the curb, a long black car waited in silence. Inside that car sat a man who had watched the entire moment without blinking. His eyes were not the eyes of an ordinary man. They were ancient, cold, and glowing faintly red in the darkness. The man was not simply a witness. He was the father of the child on that bench. And he was something far more powerful than any human Emily Carter had ever met. He was the vampire king. Emily stood slowly as the boy stared at the folded bill in his small hand, his fingers trembling slightly as if the money might disappear if he moved too quickly. The cold wind drifted through the quiet street, again rustling the dry leaves along the sidewalk. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Emily simply watched him, her tired eyes soft with concern. She knew she should probably stay until someone came looking for him, but the last bus of the night would arrive soon, and she still had a long ride home across the city. "Are you sure you know where to go?" she asked gently. The boy looked toward the small convenience store across the street where bright lights glowed behind wide glass windows. "I think so," he said quietly. "Thank you." Emily gave him a small, encouraging smile. "You are welcome. Go get something warm. It is really cold tonight." The boy nodded and slowly stepped off the bench. His movements were careful, almost hesitant, as if he had not spent much time walking alone in a city like this. Emily watched him cross the street safely before she turned back toward the bus stop. Only then did she feel the empty weight of her purse again. She knew tomorrow morning would be difficult. Breakfast might have to be skipped. Lunch might be nothing more than water and coffee from the diner. But strangely, she did not regret what she had done. Not even a little. She sat down on the cold metal bench and rubbed her hands together for warmth. The street light above flickered again, casting pale shadows across the sidewalk. Across the street, the boy pushed open the door of the convenience store and disappeared inside. Emily glanced at the digital clock mounted near the bus stop schedule. The next bus would arrive in about 10 minutes. Just enough time to rest her feet after standing for nearly 14 hours inside the diner. What Emily did not know was that the quiet black car across the street had not moved. Inside the vehicle, the man in the back seat continued to watch the bus stop through the tinted window with a stillness that seemed almost unnatural. His name was Sebastian Vale. Few humans alive had ever heard that name, and even fewer understood the weight it carried. Sebastian had walked this earth for more than 600 years. Empires had risen and fallen during that time. Kings had ruled and died. Cities had been built where forests once stood. Yet Sebastian remained exactly the same. Cold, immortal, unchanged by the passing centuries. But tonight something unusual had happened. The ancient vampire king leaned slightly forward in the shadows of the car, his crimson eyes focused on the young waitress sitting alone at the bus stop. Humans were predictable creatures. In 6 centuries he had seen greed, cruelty, betrayal, and selfishness repeated in endless variations. Humans protected their own survival above all else. They held tightly to money when they were poor. They ignored strangers when life became difficult. Yet that girl had just given away the last $20 she possessed to help a child she did not know. Sebastian had heard the conversation clearly. His hearing was far sharper than any human could imagine. He had heard the softness in her voice when she asked the boy if he was hungry. He had heard the hesitation when she opened her purse. And he had heard the quiet decision when she placed the money into Lucas' hand. Most humans would have walked away. Most would have pretended not to notice a crying child at night. But Emily Carter had not. Sebastian slowly leaned back against the dark leather seat of the car. For the first time in many years, he felt something stir in the depths of his ancient mind. Not anger, not suspicion, something far stranger. Curiosity. In the convenience store across the street, Lucas stood near the counter holding the $20 bill carefully between both hands while the cashier wrapped a warm sandwich and a cup of soup in a small paper bag. The boy looked calmer now, though his eyes still carried a quiet sadness that most people would never notice. When the cashier returned the change, Lucas simply shook his head. "Keep it," he said softly. The cashier blinked in surprise, but said nothing. Lucas turned and walked back toward the door. Outside the black car, door opened silently. A tall man stepped out onto the sidewalk with a presence so powerful that even the night air seemed to pause around him. Sebastian Vale had decided he would not leave this street just yet. Not until he understood why a struggling waitress had just changed something inside a 600-year-old vampire king. Lucas pushed open the glass door of the convenience store and stepped back onto the quiet sidewalk, holding the small paper bag carefully in both hands. Warm steam escaped from the top of the bag and drifted into the cold night air. Across the street, Emily still sat at the bus stop bench, rubbing her hands together while she waited for the last bus that would take her back to her small apartment on the edge of the city. The street remained calm and quiet, but something had changed in the atmosphere. Lucas looked up and immediately noticed the tall man standing beside the long black car parked near the curb. The man stood perfectly still beneath the dim streetlight, his posture straight and calm in a way that felt almost unnatural. His dark coat moved slightly in the wind, but the man himself did not seem affected by the cold at all. His eyes were focused entirely on the boy. Lucas did not look surprised. In fact, he seemed almost relieved. "Father," the boy said softly as he walked toward him. Sebastian Vale looked down at his son with an expression that very few living beings had ever witnessed. For centuries, the Vampire King had ruled with absolute control. His enemies feared him. His followers obeyed him. His emotions were buried beneath layers of discipline that had been forged over 600 years. Yet when Lucas stepped closer and handed him the small paper bag, something warm appeared briefly in the ancient king's eyes. "Did you thank her?" Sebastian asked quietly. Lucas nodded and glanced back toward the bus stop where Emily still waited, unaware that the two figures across the street were watching her. "She gave me money so I could eat," Lucas said. It was the last money she had. Sebastian already knew that. His supernatural hearing had caught every word of the conversation earlier. Still, hearing it again from his son caused the strange feeling of curiosity inside him to grow stronger. Humans had disappointed him countless times throughout history. Kingdoms had fallen because of human greed. Alliances had collapsed because of human betrayal. Even the fragile peace between vampires and the human world depended on constant secrecy and careful control. And yet this ordinary young waitress had chosen kindness even when she could not afford it. Sebastian followed Lucas' gaze toward the bus stop bench. Emily Carter sat quietly with her head lowered slightly, clearly exhausted after a long day of work. Her jacket was thin. Her shoes were worn. She looked like someone who carried too many burdens. For someone so young, the Vampire King observed her with careful attention. Every movement, every breath, every heartbeat. To human eyes, she was simply another tired worker waiting for a late bus. But Sebastian's senses were far more powerful than human perception. He could hear the steady rhythm of her heart from across the street. He could smell the faint scent of coffee and dish soap that clung to her clothes from the diner where she worked. And beneath all of that, he sensed something else that he could not immediately explain. Something unusual in the scent of her blood. Lucas opened the bag and pulled out the warm sandwich while he stood beside his father. The boy took a small bite and smiled faintly. "It has been a long time since someone was kind to me without knowing who I am," Lucas said quietly. Sebastian's expression did not change, but his gaze remained fixed on Emily across the street. "Kindness from strangers is rare," he replied, "especially when that kindness costs them something." Lucas looked up at him with innocent curiosity. "Are you going to speak to her?" Sebastian did not answer immediately. He continued to watch Emily Carter sitting under the flickering streetlight while cars passed slowly along the road behind her. For 6 centuries he had ruled from the shadows, carefully avoiding unnecessary contact with the human world. Humans were fragile. Their lives passed quickly. Their emotions complicated everything. Yet tonight the actions of one human had stirred something inside him that he had not felt in many decades. Finally, the ancient Vampire King began walking slowly toward the bus stop, his long coat moving quietly with each step. Lucas followed beside him, holding the paper bag and watching with quiet interest. Emily Carter was still staring down the empty road when she suddenly felt the strange sensation that someone was standing nearby. She lifted her head and looked up. A tall man with calm dark eyes stood only a few steps away from the bench, and somehow the night around him suddenly felt colder than before. Emily Carter blinked in surprise as the tall man stopped a few steps in front of the bus stop bench. Up close, he looked even more unusual than she first thought. He was tall in a quiet, commanding way, with dark hair that moved slightly in the cold wind and a calm expression that seemed almost too controlled. His coat was perfectly tailored, the kind of clothing that did not belong in the same world as late-night diners and city buses. For a brief moment, Emily wondered if he was some wealthy executive waiting for a car service. Yet something about him felt different in a way she could not explain. The night air around him seemed colder somehow, as if the temperature had quietly dropped the moment he arrived. Emily shifted slightly on the bench and looked past him toward the street. Then she noticed the boy again. The same child she had helped only minutes earlier was now standing beside the man, holding the small paper bag from the convenience store. The boy looked calmer now, his eyes bright and curious as he watched Emily. A soft smile appeared on his face when their eyes met again. "Thank you again," the boy said politely. "The food is warm." Emily relaxed a little when she saw him safe. "I'm glad you got something to eat," she replied. "Are you feeling better now?" Lucas nodded and took another small bite of the sandwich while standing beside the tall man. "Yes." The man beside him finally spoke, his voice deep and steady, carrying a quiet authority that immediately caught Emily's attention. "My son tells me you helped him tonight." Emily straightened slightly on the bench. "Your son?" She looked between the two of them and then nodded slowly. "Oh, he looked like he needed help." The man studied her carefully for a moment before speaking again. "Most people would have walked past a crying child at night. You did not." Emily shrugged gently, trying not to feel awkward under the strange intensity of his gaze. "Well, he was alone and it was cold. Anyone would have done the same thing." The man did not answer immediately. His eyes remained focused on her with a quiet observation that made Emily feel as if he was seeing far more than she expected. Lucas spoke again while holding the paper bag close to his chest. "She gave me the last $20 she had." Emily felt her face warm with embarrassment. "Well, that is not a big deal," she said quickly. "Really?" The man slowly tilted his head as if considering her words. "You're certain about that?" Emily laughed lightly, trying to ease the tension she suddenly felt. "Look, it is just money. I can always earn more tomorrow." The boy looked up at her with honest curiosity. "But you said it was the last money in your purse." Emily rubbed the back of her neck and smiled awkwardly. "Yeah, well, that part might be true, but it is okay. I will survive." The man remained silent again, his expression calm yet thoughtful. His gaze briefly moved toward the quiet street behind Emily, where the bus headlights would soon appear. "You work at the diner across the street," he said calmly. Emily blinked in surprise. "Yes. How did you know that?" The man answered without hesitation. "I saw you leave earlier." Emily nodded slowly, accepting the explanation even though something about it still felt strange. The man's presence carried a calm confidence that made it difficult to question him too closely. Lucas suddenly stepped closer to Emily and looked up at her with bright curiosity. "Why were you not scared to talk to me?" he asked. Emily smiled warmly. "Because you looked like you needed someone to talk to. That is all." The boy seemed satisfied with the answer and returned to eating his sandwich. For a moment, the three of them stood quietly beneath the dim streetlight while passing cars moved slowly along the distant intersection. Emily glanced down the road again and finally noticed the faint glow of approaching headlights. "My bus should be here soon," she said while standing up from the bench. "I am glad you found your father." The tall man studied her again, his ancient eyes calm and unreadable. As Emily adjusted her jacket against the cold wind, he spoke one more quiet sentence. "Miss Carter," he said slowly, his voice low and steady. "I believe this is not the last time our paths will cross." The distant headlights of the city bus slowly grew brighter as it approached the quiet corner of Maple Street and 7th Avenue. The low rumble of the engine echoed through the nearly empty street, while the wind carried the faint smell of rain that might arrive before morning. Emily Carter shifted the strap of her worn purse on her shoulder and stepped closer to the curb. Her feet ached from standing all evening at the diner, and the thought of finally sitting down during the long ride home felt like the greatest comfort in the world. Yet something about the moment behind her still lingered in her mind. She glanced back briefly at the tall man and the boy standing beneath the streetlight. The man had spoken her name, even though she had never introduced herself. That small detail continued to puzzle her. Maybe he heard the boy say it earlier, she thought. Or maybe the name tag from the diner uniform had been visible when she crossed the street. There were many simple explanations. Still, the strange calm authority in the man's voice had left a quiet impression she could not easily ignore. Lucas watched the approaching bus with curiosity while finishing the last bite of his sandwich. The warm food had already eased the tension in his small shoulders. He looked up at his father again with innocent interest. "She is leaving," he said softly. Sebastian Vale did not respond immediately. His crimson eyes followed Emily's movement as she stepped toward the bus stop sign. In the passing glow of the bus headlights, her tired figure looked even more fragile than before. Yet the ancient vampire king could still hear the steady rhythm of her heart from across the street. Calm, honest, unafraid. It was a sound he had not associated with humans in a very long time. Lucas tilted his head slightly while studying his father's face. "You're thinking again," he said quietly. Sebastian allowed a faint shadow of a smile to appear for the briefest moment. "I am observing," he replied. Lucas glanced toward Emily once more. "She did not ask for anything after helping me," the boy said. "She did not even ask where I lived." Sebastian nodded slowly. "That is exactly what interests me." The bus finally pulled up to the curb with a gentle hiss of air brakes. The folding doors opened, and the driver leaned slightly toward the entrance. Emily stepped onto the first stair and paused just long enough to look back one final time. Lucas gave her a small wave, which she returned with a warm smile before climbing fully into the bus. A moment later the doors closed, and the vehicle slowly began to move down the street. Sebastian watched the bus disappear into the night traffic without moving. Lucas looked up at him again. "Are we going home now?" he asked. The ancient king remained silent for a moment longer while his senses followed the fading sound of the bus engine. "No," Sebastian said calmly. "Not yet." Lucas' eyes widened slightly with curiosity. "Why not?" Sebastian's gaze shifted back toward the empty bench at the bus stop where Emily had been sitting only moments earlier. "Because tonight we learned something unusual about the human world," he said quietly. Lucas considered this with thoughtful silence. The boy had spent much of his life hidden within the protected walls of places most humans never knew existed. Encounters with ordinary people were rare for him. "She was kind," Lucas said simply. "Yes," Sebastian replied. "She was." Lucas then asked the question that had been forming in his mind since the moment Emily placed the folded money into his hand. "Will you see her again?" Sebastian did not answer immediately. The wind moved softly through the quiet street, while distant traffic lights changed color at the intersection down the block. Finally, the vampire king turned back toward the black car waiting beside the curb. His voice remained calm, but carried the quiet certainty of someone used to shaping events far beyond the understanding of ordinary people. "Yes," he said at last. "I believe that will happen very soon." Lucas smiled slightly as he followed his father toward the car. Neither of them noticed the faint movement on the rooftop of a nearby building where a shadowy figure had been silently watching the entire scene from above. The figure disappeared into the darkness the moment the car door closed. Somewhere in the city, news had already begun to travel through hidden networks that only the supernatural world understood. The vampire king had shown interest in human girl. And in the ancient world of vampires, that kind of interest could change everything. The black car moved silently through the late night streets of the city, while distant traffic lights reflected across the polished surface of its windows. Inside the vehicle, Lucas sat quietly beside his father, looking out at the passing buildings with calm curiosity. The warm food had lifted his mood, yet his thoughts still drifted back to the young waitress who had helped him without hesitation. Most people never noticed children when they cried in public places. Lucas had learned that lesson many times. But Emily Carter had noticed. She had stopped. She had cared. Across from him, Sebastian. Vale sat perfectly still, his gaze fixed forward while the city lights slid across his calm expression. The driver in the front seat spoke quietly through the privacy screen after several minutes of silence. "Your Majesty, we have confirmed that the girl boarded the downtown bus line heading east. She will arrive near Riverside District in approximately 20 minutes. Sebastian did not react outwardly, but his attention sharpened slightly. The information was exactly what he expected. "Thank you," he replied calmly. Lucas turned his head toward him with immediate interest. "You're still watching where she goes," he said. Sebastian glanced briefly toward his son. "Knowledge is never wasted," he answered. Lucas leaned back against the seat while considering this. "She lives far away from here," he observed after a moment. Sebastian nodded slowly. The Riverside District was one of the older neighborhoods in the city, filled with narrow streets, aging apartment buildings, and families who worked long hours simply to remain there. Emily Carter had likely grown up learning how to survive difficult circumstances. That much was already clear from the way she carried herself. A person who gave away their last $20 did not come from a life of luxury. Lucas continued watching the city through the window while the car passed beneath a row of tall street lamps. Do humans always struggle this much? He asked quietly. Sebastian considered the question with thoughtful silence. Many do, he replied. Humans are fragile creatures in a complicated world. Lucas looked down at his small hands resting in his lap. Then why did she help me when she knew she needed the money? Sebastian turned slightly in his seat. That question, he said quietly, is exactly why I'm interested in her. The car slowed briefly at a red traffic light. Outside, pedestrians crossed the street beneath glowing storefront signs while the city continued its endless movement. In the shadows above those streets, however, another world existed. A hidden world that most humans never realized was there. Within that world, the actions of the Vampire King were already being discussed in quiet whispers. On the rooftop of a tall building several blocks away from the diner, two pale figures stood watching the distant traffic with sharp attention. They had followed the black car since it left Maple Street. One of them spoke in a low voice. The king rarely involves himself with humans, the first figure said. The second nodded slowly. Yet tonight, he watched that girl for several minutes. That is unusual. Their eyes followed the car as it turned toward the highway that led toward Riverside District. Should we report this to the council? The first figure asked. The second figure remained silent for a moment before answering. Not yet. We will observe a little longer. Meanwhile, the car, carrying Sebastian and Lucas, continued moving quietly through the city. After several more minutes, the driver spoke again. Your Majesty, we are approaching the district where the girl will arrive. Lucas straightened slightly in his seat. Are we going to see where she lives? He asked with excitement. Sebastian's voice remained calm and measured. We're simply making sure she arrives home safely. Lucas smiled faintly, satisfied with the answer. Outside the window, the streets became narrower as the car entered Riverside District. The buildings were older here. Many of the street lights flickered. Small family restaurants and laundromats lined the sidewalks. A few minutes later, the city bus appeared ahead, slowing as it approached the final stop at the corner of Riverside Avenue. Inside the bus, Emily Carter stood near the door while holding the rail for balance. She looked even more exhausted than before. The long shift at the diner and the cold evening had drained the last of her energy. Yet she still carried the quiet comfort of knowing she had helped a child who needed it. As the bus doors opened and Emily stepped down onto the sidewalk, she had no idea that the same black car she had seen earlier was already waiting silently at the far end of the street. And inside that car, a 600-year-old vampire king was watching her once again. Emily Carter stepped away from the bus stop on Riverside Avenue and pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders as the cold wind moved through the quiet street. The neighborhood was calmer than the downtown district she had just left behind. Old apartment buildings stood close together along the narrow sidewalks, their windows glowing softly with warm yellow light. Somewhere nearby, a radio played faint music from an open window, and the smell of fresh bread drifted from a small bakery that would open before sunrise. Emily walked slowly along the cracked pavement, her steps heavy. After the long day, she was tired enough that her mind kept drifting back to the strange encounter at the bus stop earlier that evening. The tall man and the boy had appeared almost out of nowhere, and there had been something unusual about them that she could not fully explain. The man had known her name. He had watched her more carefully than any stranger normally would. Yet he had also been polite, calm, and strangely respectful. Emily shook her head gently as she turned onto a smaller side street that led toward her apartment building. It had probably just been a worried father looking for his child, she told herself. That explanation made the most sense. At the far end of the street, the long black car remained parked in shadow beneath a broken streetlight. Its engine was quiet, its dark windows reflecting the faint glow of the nearby buildings. Inside the vehicle, Lucas leaned slightly forward in his seat so he could see through the windshield. There she is, he said softly with a hint of excitement in his voice. Sebastian Vale watched silently, as Emily continued walking down the sidewalk. The ancient vampire king observed everything about the environment around her. The slow rhythm of her footsteps, the steady beat of her heart, the faint sound of keys in her purse as they moved with each step. She was alone, completely alone in the quiet street. Humans in this district had grown used to late-night shifts and early morning work hours. It was common to see someone walking home this late. Yet the hidden world that moved in the shadows of the city knew how vulnerable that situation could be. Sebastian turned his attention briefly toward the rooftops above the street. His senses were sharper than any human could imagine. He could hear distant footsteps on brick surfaces several buildings away. He could smell the faint scent of unfamiliar vampires lingering in the cold air. The watchers from earlier had followed them here. Lucas noticed the subtle change in his father's posture. "Are we still being followed?" he asked quietly. Sebastian's voice remained calm. "Yes, 2 of them." Lucas frowned slightly. "Are they dangerous?" "Not to us," Sebastian replied, "but their curiosity could become a problem for her." Lucas looked back through the windshield toward Emily again. She had stopped briefly outside an old apartment, building with peeling paint and narrow balconies. A small light glowed above the entrance door. Emily reached into her purse and pulled out a set of keys. She looked tired but peaceful, unaware of the quiet tension building in the shadows above the street. On a rooftop across the road, 2 pale figures crouched behind a low wall, watching the scene unfold below them. One of them spoke in a whisper. "The king has followed the human girl all the way to her home." The second figure narrowed his eyes. "That confirms it. His interest in her is real." "Should we intervene?" the first asked. The second figure hesitated. Interfering with the vampire king directly would be a dangerous mistake. "Not yet," he said quietly. "We will continue observing." Back inside the car, Lucas watched Emily unlock the door of the apartment building. She stepped inside and disappeared from view. For several seconds, the street returned to silence. Lucas looked up at his father again. "She is safe now," he said. Sebastian remained still for a moment longer, his attention focused on the building where Emily had entered. Then he gave a small nod. "Yes, for tonight, she is safe." Lucas tilted his head slightly. "For tonight," he repeated. Sebastian's gaze lifted once more toward the rooftop where the hidden watchers remained. The ancient king's eyes glowed faintly in the darkness as a quiet warning passed through the air between predators. The watchers understood immediately that they had been noticed. One of them stepped back from the edge of the roof with visible tension. "The king knows we are here," he whispered. Sebastian finally spoke again, his voice calm but firm as he reached for the car door handle. "This situation is no longer only about curiosity," he said quietly. "Someone else has already begun to take interest in the girl who helped my son, and that makes her part of a much larger story than she could ever imagine." Emily Carter climbed the narrow staircase inside the old apartment building with slow, tired steps, the dim hallway lights flickering softly above her. The building smelled faintly of laundry, soap, and old wood, the familiar scent of a place where many people worked long hours and returned home late at night. She reached the second floor and paused for a moment outside her small apartment door, fishing her keys out. Of her purse again, her shoulders sagged as the exhaustion from the day finally settled over her. The long shift at the diner, the cold evening air, and the strange encounter with the boy and his father all swirled together in her mind. She unlocked the door and stepped inside her tiny apartment, closing the door gently behind her. The room was simple but clean. A small couch stood near the window. A tiny kitchen sat along one wall. A single lamp illuminated the space with warm yellow light. Emily kicked off her shoes and placed her purse on the small table near the door. For a moment, she simply stood there in silence, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. Then she exhaled slowly and smiled to herself. At least the boy had something warm to eat tonight. That thought alone made the sacrifice of the $20 feel worthwhile. Outside on the street, the black car remained parked beneath the broken streetlight. Inside the vehicle, Lucas continued watching the apartment building with interest. "She looks very tired," he said softly. Sebastian Vale remained perfectly still in the seat beside him, his attention focused on the second-floor window where a faint light had just appeared. Yes, he replied quietly. Her life requires constant effort. Lucas frowned slightly as he considered that. Humans work very hard just to live, he said. Sebastian nodded slowly. Many do. The ancient king then lifted his gaze toward the rooftops again. The watchers had not left. Their presence lingered like a faint echo in the night air. They were careful now, keeping their distance after realizing that the king had noticed them earlier. Yet their curiosity remained strong. Lucas noticed his father's attention shift again. Are they still there? He asked. Yes, Sebastian answered calmly. Lucas leaned closer to the window, trying to see the rooftops above the street. Why do they care about her? He asked. Sebastian's eyes narrowed slightly as he considered the situation. Because when the vampire king shows interest in a human, the entire hidden world begins asking questions. Lucas blinked with mild surprise. But you only watch her because she helped me, he said. Sebastian gave a quiet nod. That is true. Unfortunately, the rest of our kind rarely believes in simple explanations. High above them, the two pale figures remained crouched behind the low wall of the rooftop. One of them shifted nervously. The king is still here, he whispered. The second figure nodded. Of course he is. That girl has become important to him somehow. Important humans are dangerous, the first figure said quietly. They can expose our world if they become too involved. The second figure considered that carefully. The council will want to know about this, he said. If the king continues to show interest in a human girl, it could create conflict. Below on the street, Sebastian slowly opened the car door and stepped out onto the pavement. The cold wind moved through his dark coat as he looked once more toward the apartment building where Emily now rested inside. Lucas stepped out of the car as well and looked up at him. Are we leaving now? He asked. Sebastian's voice remained calm and thoughtful. Yes, for tonight, we will leave her in peace. Lucas looked back at the building one more time. She was kind to me, he said softly. Sebastian's gaze remained steady as he replied. And kindness has consequences in a world like ours. Lucas tilted his head slightly. What kind of consequences? He asked. Sebastian's eyes lifted toward the rooftops where the watchers still hid in the darkness. The kind that attract attention from powerful people, he said quietly. And when powerful people begin paying attention to an ordinary human girl, her life rarely stays ordinary for long. Far above them, the two watchers silently disappeared into the night shadows, already moving to deliver their report to those who ruled the hidden vampire council. And inside her small apartment, Emily Carter had no idea that her simple act of kindness had just placed her name into conversations that would soon reach the most powerful vampires in the city. Morning arrived slowly over Riverside District as pale sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Emily Carter's small apartment. The quiet hum of the city waking up drifted through the open window along with the distant sound of delivery trucks and early commuters beginning another long day. Emily stirred on the small couch where she had fallen asleep the night before, still wearing the same clothes from her shift at the diner. She sat up slowly and rubbed her eyes, feeling the familiar stiffness in her shoulders after too little rest. For a few moments, she simply stared at the soft morning light filling the room while her mind struggled to catch up with the new day. Then reality returned all at once. She remembered the empty purse sitting on the table. She remembered giving away her last $20 to the crying child at the bus stop. Emily let out a quiet breath and stood up, stretching her tired arms above her head. It would be a difficult week, but she had faced worse. She walked to the small kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of tap water before glancing at the clock above the sink. If she hurried, she could still make it to the diner in time for the morning shift. Across the city, far from the aging buildings of Riverside District, another morning was unfolding in a place few humans would ever see. Deep beneath the towering skyline stood an ancient stone structure hidden behind layers of modern construction and security. Within its underground chambers, the Vampire Council gathered around a long table carved from black marble. Tall candles burned with steady flames along the walls, casting pale light across the silent figures seated in the chamber. The room carried the heavy stillness of centuries of power and authority. One of the watchers who had observed Sebastian the night before stood before the council with his head slightly lowered. "We followed the king after he left Maple Street," the watcher reported quietly. "He tracked the human girl to her residence in Riverside District and remained outside the building for several minutes." A tall vampire with silver hair leaned forward in his seat. "The king rarely follows humans," he said slowly. "Did the girl appear aware of his presence?" "No," the watcher replied. "She believes she simply helped a lost child at a bus stop." Another member of the council folded his hands thoughtfully. "And the child was Prince Lucas, correct?" "Yes," the watcher answered. The room grew quiet as the council members exchanged cautious glances. The silver-haired vampire spoke again. "Then the situation is more complicated than we first believed. A human girl has unknowingly helped the son of the vampire king. And now the king himself has taken interest in her life." The watcher hesitated before speaking again. "Your counsel, there's something else." The king senses the other observers in the area. He knows that. Attention has already begun to form around the girl. One of the older vampires slowly rose from his seat. "That is exactly what concerns us," he said calmly. "When a powerful vampire shows interest in a human, the boundaries between our world and theirs begin to blur." Meanwhile, across the city, Emily Carter finished tying her hair into a simple ponytail while standing in front of the small bathroom mirror in her apartment. She grabbed her diner uniform jacket and slung her purse over her shoulder before heading toward the door. Her stomach growled quietly as she realized she would be starting the day without breakfast, but she pushed the thought aside. She had work to do. Outside the building, the morning air felt fresh and cool as she stepped onto the sidewalk. The city looked completely different in daylight. Children waited for school buses. Shop owners opened their doors. The world continued moving as if nothing unusual had happened the night before. Emily walked toward the bus stop once again, unaware that far away in the hidden chambers beneath the city, her name had just been spoken for the first time among the most powerful vampires in existence. And in the center seat of the council chamber, one voice spoke with quiet authority. "If the king continues to involve himself with this human girl, the council must decide whether she becomes protected by his interest or eliminated as a potential threat." The chamber fell silent as the weight of those words settled across the ancient room. Emily Carter pushed open the glass door of the diner just as the morning rush began to build. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon filled the warm room, while the familiar sound of plates clinking and customers talking greeted her like it did every single day. The diner had been part of the Riverside District for more than 40 years, and almost everyone in the neighborhood knew it. Truck drivers stopped there before long routes. Construction workers came in for strong coffee before sunrise. Parents grabbed quick breakfasts before taking their children to school. Emily moved quickly behind the counter and tied her apron around her waist while her coworker Janet glanced over with a tired smile. "You look like you barely slept," Janet said while pouring coffee into a row of mugs. Emily shrugged lightly and picked up a stack of menus. "It was a long night," she replied. That was not entirely a lie. Her mind still drifted back to the boy she had met and the strange, calm father who had appeared beside him. There had been something unusual about that man. Something powerful in the way he carried himself. Emily could not explain it, but the memory kept returning every time she tried to focus on the morning work. Meanwhile, far beneath the busy city streets, the ancient council chamber remained locked in quiet discussion. The silver-haired vampire who had spoken earlier slowly walked along the long stone table while the other council members watched him carefully. "The keen interest in the girl creates risk," he said calmly. "Humans are not meant to move close to our world." Another elder vampire folded his pale hands together. "Yet the girl has done nothing wrong. She showed kindness to a child she believed was alone." The silver-haired vampire stopped walking and turned toward the others. "That is exactly the problem. Kind humans attract attention. Attention creates curiosity. Curiosity exposes secrets." One of the watchers who had followed Sebastian the night before stepped forward again. "Your counsel, there is more information. The king did not simply watch her. He tracked her home and remained outside the building until he confirmed she was safe. The chamber fell silent. Even among vampires, that behavior was unusual. The king had ruled their kind for centuries with calm distance from the human world. The silver-haired vampire spoke slowly. Then we must determine whether the girl is simply a passing curiosity or something more dangerous. Across the city, the morning shift at the diner continued moving quickly. Emily carried plates of pancakes and coffee between tables while the sound of conversation filled the room. For a brief moment, she almost forgot about the strange events of the previous night. Then the bell above the diner door rang softly as a new customer entered. Emily turned automatically, ready to greet whoever had arrived. The words stopped in her throat the moment she saw who stood in the doorway. The tall man from the bus stop stepped calmly into the diner as if he belonged there. He wore the same dark coat and carried the same quiet presence that made the room seem slightly colder than before. For a second, Emily wondered if she was imagining things. Yet there he was standing just inside the entrance while his calm eyes moved slowly across the room. Their gazes met almost immediately. Emily blinked in surprise. The man walked toward the counter and took a seat on one of the stools as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Janet leaned closer to Emily and whispered quietly, "Well, that guy looks like he stepped out of a movie." Emily forced herself to stay calm as she walked over with a menu in her hand. "Good morning," she said politely. "What can I get for you?" The man looked up at her with the same steady gaze she remembered from the night before. "Good morning, Miss Carter," he replied calmly. Emily froze for half a second. "You remember my name?" she said slowly. The man gave a faint nod. "Of course I do." Emily tried to shake off the strange feeling creeping in her thoughts. "What would you like to order?" she asked again. The man studied her for a moment before answering. "Coffee will be fine." Emily nodded and turned to grab a mug from the counter. As she poured the coffee, she could feel his attention still resting on her. Something about his presence made the entire room feel quieter, even though the diner was full of customers. When she placed the cup in front of him, he spoke again in the same calm voice. "My son wanted me to thank you properly for helping him last night." Emily leaned slightly against the counter. "It was not a big deal," she said. "He was just a kid who needed food." The man's eyes softened slightly. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is exactly why I wanted to see you again. Because kindness like that is very rare in this city." Emily smiled politely, still unsure what to make of the situation. "Well, I'm glad he is safe," she said. The man lifted the coffee cup, but did not drink from it immediately. His eyes remained fixed on her face. "Miss Carter," he said calmly, "there is something about you that my world will soon begin to notice." Emily frowned slightly. "I am sorry, what do you mean by that?" The man took a slow sip of coffee before answering. "It means that the small act of kindness you showed my son last night may have changed more than you realize." Emily Carter stared at the man across the counter while the noise of the diner continued around them. Plates clinked against tables. Coffee machines hissed. Customers talked about work and traffic and ordinary problems that filled an ordinary morning. Yet at that moment, it felt as if the world inside the diner had grown strangely distant. The man's words echoed in her mind. "The small act of kindness you showed my son last night may have changed more than you realize." Emily folded her arms lightly across the counter and leaned closer. "I only helped a hungry kid at a bus stop," she said. "I do not see how that changes anything." The tall man watched her quietly. His calm expression never shifted, yet something in his eyes suggested he was measuring every word she spoke. "Sometimes the smallest actions create the largest consequences," he replied. Emily gave a small, uncertain laugh. "Well, if buying a sandwich for a kid can change the world, then maybe this city needs more sandwiches." Behind her, Janet called out an order number while sliding 2 plates of eggs toward another server. Emily turned briefly to deliver coffee to a nearby table. When she returned a moment later, the man was still there, sitting exactly the same way he had been before. The cup of coffee in front of him had barely moved. "You never told me your name," Emily said as she picked up a cloth and wiped the counter. The man studied her for a moment before answering. "My name is Sebastian." Emily nodded. "Nice to meet you, Sebastian." "I am Emily, but I guess you already knew that part." Sebastian allowed the faintest hint of a smile to appear. Yes, I did. Emily leaned slightly closer again. And your son is Lucas, right? He seemed like a good kid. Sebastian's eyes softened for a brief second when she mentioned the boy. He is, he said quietly. That is why your kindness mattered more than you realize. Emily was about to ask another question when the bell above the diner door rang again. Two men stepped inside. At first glance, they looked like ordinary customers wearing dark jackets and serious expressions. But Sebastian noticed them immediately. Their scent reached him before their footsteps crossed the floor. Vampires, and not friendly ones. Emily noticed the shift in his attention. Something wrong, she asked quietly. Sebastian did not answer right away. His gaze followed the two men as they walked toward the far side of the diner and took a table near the window. Their movements were controlled and careful, the kind used by predators who preferred not to reveal themselves. One of them glanced briefly toward the counter before looking away again. Emily felt a strange tension in the air, but could not explain why. Those guys seem intense, she whispered. Sebastian lowered his voice slightly. They are not here for breakfast. Emily blinked. Then why are they here? Sebastian looked directly into her eyes again. Because news travels quickly in my world, and last night your kindness attracted attention. Emily frowned. What world are you talking about? Before Sebastian could answer, the two men stood from their table. One of them began walking slowly toward the counter. The other remained near the window, watching the entire room carefully. Emily felt her stomach tighten with unease. The approaching man stopped several feet away from Sebastian and spoke calmly. Your Majesty, he said quietly, the council requests your presence immediately. Emily stared at the man in confusion. Your Majesty, she repeated softly. Sebastian remained seated, but his eyes had grown colder than before. Tell the council I will speak with them later, he replied. The messenger did not move. This matter involves the human girl, he said, and the council believes she may already be a threat. Emily felt her breath catch. A threat to who? Sebastian slowly stood from the stool beside the counter. The entire diner suddenly felt smaller as his presence filled the space. No one touches her, he said quietly. The messenger hesitated before answering. Your Majesty, the council fears what may happen if a human becomes too close to your son. Sebastian's voice dropped to a tone that carried absolute authority. Then the council should learn to fear something else. Emily watched the exchange with growing confusion and fear. She did not understand what was happening, but one thing was becoming very clear. The quiet father she met at the bus stop was not an ordinary man. In whatever world he belonged to was now beginning to pull her into it. The diner had grown quieter, but the tension inside the room felt heavier than the morning rush that had filled it only minutes earlier. Customers sensed that something unusual was happening even if they could not explain it. Conversations lowered. A few people glanced toward the counter where Sebastian now stood facing the two men who had entered earlier. Emily Carter remained frozen beside the coffee machine, her heart beating faster as she tried to understand what she had just heard. Your Majesty. The words repeated in her mind like a puzzle she could not solve. The man standing in front of Sebastian spoke again in a respectful but firm tone. The council does not make this request lightly. The human girl has already attracted attention. Sebastian's gaze remained calm but unmovable. The council concerns do not override my decision. The messenger lowered his voice slightly. With respect, Your Majesty, the council believes the girl presence near the prince creates a risk to our secrecy. Emily felt her breath catch again. She looked between the men, trying to understand if this was some strange joke or something far more serious. Secrecy about what? She asked quietly. Sebastian turned toward her for the first time since the men had approached. For a brief moment his expression softened again, almost as if he regretted that the situation had reached this point. Emily, he said calmly, there are truths about the world that most humans never see. Emily shook her head slightly. You keep saying things like that, but I have no idea what you mean. The messenger stepped closer. That is exactly the problem, he said quietly. Humans who begin asking questions can expose everything. Sebastian's eyes flashed with cold authority. Enough. The single word carried such power that both messengers instinctively stepped back. Emily felt the air in the diner grow colder again, just as it had the night before the bus stop. Sebastian looked back at her and spoke with calm honesty. The men you see here belong to a council that governs a world hidden inside your own. Emily stared at him in disbelief. What kind of world? Sebastian answered without hesitation. The world of vampires. For a moment, Emily thought she had misunderstood the sentence. Then she looked carefully at the two messengers standing near the door. Their pale faces, their unnatural stillness, the way they seemed to move without making sound. Suddenly, the strange feeling she had experienced since meeting Sebastian made terrible sense. "You are serious," she whispered. "Yes," Sebastian replied. The room fell completely silent as the weight of the truth settled around them. Emily leaned against the counter to steady herself. "Vampires are not real," she said quietly. Sebastian looked at her calmly. "And yet here I stand." Emily searched his face for some sign of humor, but found none. The messenger spoke again with urgency. "Your Majesty, the council will not allow a human to become connected to the royal family." Sebastian's voice became colder than before. The girl did not seek that connection. She showed kindness to a hungry child. That child happened to be my son. Emily slowly looked from Sebastian to the messenger again. "Your son," she repeated softly. The messenger nodded grimly. "The boy you helped last night is Lucas Vale, heir to the oldest vampire bloodline in this city." Emily felt the room spin slightly. That sweet child at the bus stop was a vampire prince. Sebastian stepped closer to her, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "You treated him like any other child who needed help. That is why this situation matters so much." Emily swallowed slowly. "I did not know who he was." Sebastian nodded. "Exactly." The messenger took another cautious step forward. "Your Majesty, the council demands that the girl memory be erased before she learns more." Emily looked up sharply. "Erased?" Sebastian's expression hardened instantly. "No one touches her mind," he said firmly. The messenger hesitated. "Then the council will consider her a liability." Sebastian's voice carried absolute authority as he answered. "Then the council can bring their concerns directly to me." Emily looked between them again, realizing the situation had grown far larger than anything she could imagine. She had simply helped a child who was crying at a bus stop. Now powerful creatures were arguing over her fate. Sebastian turned back toward her with a calmer tone. "Emily," he said quietly, "the world you believed you lived in is only part of the truth. And now that truth has begun to find you." Emily stared at him, overwhelmed by the impossible revelation. "If what you're saying is real," she said slowly, "then why are you protecting me?" Sebastian answered with simple honesty. "Because kindness deserves protection. And because my son will never forget the human who helped him when no one else would." The diner remained quiet for several long seconds after Sebastian's words settled into the air. Emily Carter stood behind the counter, her hands resting on the cool metal surface while her mind struggled to absorb everything she had just heard. Vampires, a hidden council, a prince she had unknowingly helped at a bus stop. It all sounded impossible, yet the calm certainty in Sebastian's voice made it impossible to dismiss. The two messengers exchanged uncertain glances near the door, clearly realizing that the situation had reached a point where it could no longer remain hidden. Finally, one of them spoke again. "Your Majesty, the council will demand an answer." Sebastian turned slowly toward them. "They will receive one." His tone was calm, but the authority in his voice left no room for argument. The messenger hesitated before nodding slightly. "Then we will report your decision." Both men stepped back toward the diner entrance and left without another word. The bell above the door rang softly as they disappeared onto the street. Inside the diner, the tension slowly faded. A few customers returned to their meals, still confused about what they had just witnessed, but unwilling to question it further. Emily remained standing in the same place, staring at Sebastian. "So this is real," she said quietly. Sebastian nodded once. "Yes." Emily let out a slow breath and sat down on the stool behind the counter. "I helped a vampire prince without even knowing it," she said softly. Sebastian stepped closer to the counter again, his voice gentle now. You helped a hungry child. That is all that truly matters. Emily looked up at him. But now your council thinks I am dangerous. Sebastian shook his head slightly. The council fears what they do not control. Kindness is something they rarely understand. Emily was silent for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been forming in her mind since the moment he revealed the truth. What happens to me now? Sebastian looked at her with steady calm. Nothing will happen to you. You will continue living your life exactly as you always have. Emily frowned slightly. The council will accept that. They will accept my decision. At that moment, the diner door opened again. Lucas stepped inside and walked directly toward the counter with a small smile. Emily blinked in surprise. Lucas. The boy nodded happily. Hello, Emily. I wanted to say thank you. Again, Emily could not help smiling back at him. You already did that last night. Lucas shook his head gently. But you helped me when you thought I was just a normal kid. That means a lot. Emily leaned forward on the counter. You were a normal kid. You were just hungry. Lucas seemed pleased by the answer. Sebastian watched the exchange quietly. In that simple moment, he saw something that had been missing from the vampire world for a very long time. Genuine kindness without fear or expectation. After a few minutes, Lucas turned back toward the door. We should go home now, father, he said. Sebastian nodded and looked back at Emily. Before leaving, he placed several folded bills on the counter beside the coffee cup. Emily immediately shook her head. I do not need your money. Sebastian gently pushed the bills back toward her. This is not payment, he said calmly. Consider it breakfast for the rest of the week. Emily hesitated, then slowly accepted the money with a grateful smile. Thank you. Sebastian gave a small, respectful nod before turning toward the door with Lucas beside him. As they stepped outside into the morning sunlight, the city continued moving like any ordinary day. Inside the diner, Emily watched them leave and shook her head in disbelief. Yesterday, she had been just another waitress finishing a late shift. Today she knew that vampires existed and that the king of their world had just defended her life. Yet despite everything, the truth remained simple. All of it had started because she refused to ignore a child who was crying at a bus stop. And somewhere deep in the hidden world of vampires, that small act of kindness would be remembered for a very long time.